Welcome and thank you for joining me for Tax Break. This is a podcast about South African tax for South African tax professionals and practitioners. My name is Pieter van der Swan, and in each episode I share my thoughts with you on a topic or a recent development in South African tax. And I try to keep the episodes short enough that you can listen to them whenever you've got a few minutes in your calendar. Now, before we start off, I would like to ask you that if you like the podcast or this episode, whether you would mind sending it to one other person who you think would also be interested in listening to the podcast. And in this way, you can help me grow the listener base of the podcast over time. Right, so into our topic for today. So we are talking about readily apparent, undisputed errors. So let's start off by what is it, why does it matter, where do we find it in the law? So we find it in Section 93 of the Tax Administration Act, and that section deals with reduced assessments. So it basically deals with instances where SARS may or must reduce an assessment. And it's got a listing of items or instances in which these assessments must be reduced. So it includes, for example, following a dispute, settlement, etc. The specific item that we are looking at is in Section 93(1)(d). And it says that if SARS is satisfied that there was a readily apparent, undisputed error by SARS or a taxpayer, it may reduce an assessment. Now, while we are talking about Section 93(1)(d), there is something that not completely in the line of what the term readily apparent undisputed error means, but I do think it makes sense to just quickly mention it, and that's the timing of when this rule or this provision can be applied. So it is linked to the prescription periods for the specific assessment that we find in Section 99, and it says that if SARS becomes aware of the error before expiry of these periods, the error may even be reduced, or the assessment may even be reduced for the error after the prescription periods. Now, the mechanism to ask for or to request a reduced assessment under Section 93 doesn't replace, especially 93(1)(d), doesn't replace an objection. So that route of, or that remedy, if you are unhappy about your assessment, still remain. Section 93(1)(d) just gives you a less formal process that you can follow to also get your assessment reduced. Now, I did an earlier episode, in fact very early in the podcast, episode 6, that if you want to listen to the decision, should you object, should you follow Section 93 and some of the considerations there, you can go back and listen to episode 6. So why are we talking about a readily apparent undisputed errors today? SARS recently issued a draft interpretation note for comment. It's the second round of this interpretation note. And although even the interpretation note, once it becomes finalized, isn't binding, and there's case law there that confirms this, it does give us a very good indication of SARS's interpretation and views of a specific provision. So, in other words, what you are likely to encounter if you were to apply this provision. Now, even though this interpretation note is still in draft, it does give us an indication as to what SARS's position would be. So, the draft interpretation note explains the process. I'm not going to focus on the operational side today. If you are unsure how to apply this or how to apply for this, go and have a look at the draft interpretation notes process. You may then find that helpful. What I would like to focus on are some of the key points in the draft interpretation note on applying the provision within Section 93(1)(d), dealing with readily apparent undisputed errors. The first point that SARS touches on there is that the provision says SARS may reduce the assessment if satisfied that the requirements of Section 93(1)(d) are met. So the may suggests a discretion, but SARS indicates that in the context where it's used, if the provisions of Section 93(1)(d) plus the relevant law, so in other words, whatever the error is about, are met, then SARS must exercise this discretion to reduce the assessment. As to what they need to be satisfied, again, the draft interpretation note suggests that there's some sort of a subjective discretion on SARS, but it's not an unfettered discretion. So what the draft interpretation note says is that SARS must apply an objective approach to exercise this discretion, and they must look at all reasonable grounds, and that's for the taxpayer to provide those grounds to SARS. Right. Second point, there must be an error. So in other words, there must be a mistake. What SARS indicates is that mistake can be in a return, in an assessment, or even in an underlying record. Then the critical one, and the mistake or the error must be readily apparent. So this was specifically introduced into the law in 2015. So what we take from this is that it's not all errors that qualify for Section 93(1)(d). It must be a specific type of error, a readily apparent one. So SARS's views on this is that the error must be clearly or easily visible, must be identifiable without difficulty. But I think those things can be probably a bit subjective to say how easily is it visible or how difficult is it to identify. So they go into quite a bit of detail there. The guidance that they offer in the draft interpretation note is that they accept the fact that there may be some verification necessary or required to confirm the error. But what they specifically then say is they believe it's a simple face value verification. It's not an in-detailed verification or investigation that's necessary. They, in the same line, they also indicate that the error must be obvious. So again, referring back to the simple face value verification, it shouldn't involve them having to verify or examine volumes of supporting documents or interpret complex laws, contracts, or even tax treaties. And then the last point that they make is that the mistake must be unquestionable. So SARS must be able to look at the documents and the return and immediately see that there's a mistake, and it's not questionable whether there is one or not. So whether this applies in a specific context or not, my experience is it really depends on the facts of each case. And you could probably make arguments to both sides, a very narrow view as to where very few things would be readily apparent, and perhaps more generous view for a taxpayer as to what could still be considered readily apparent. So my experience with this is that this is a point that could be contentious. Probably also why SARS then goes into quite a bit of detail in the draft interpretation note. Lastly, the error must be undisputed. So the error must therefore not be questioned, challenged, and it must be accepted by SARS. As soon as SARS takes a view to say, but they don't agree with this, or it was, for example, something that was subject to dispute and SARS didn't accept your position, then that error is no longer undisputed. Right, so in summary and to close off, I think two things to take home. The first one is to be aware of the Section 93(1)(d) process. It's a less formal route to get a reduction of an assessment. But, and that's the second point, to be aware that there are very specific requirements, and they could be quite narrow, that you need to meet to fall into Section 93(1)(d). And that's again where, going back to episode 6, you could have to be required to make the decision, do you object or do you follow Section 93(1)(d). That's it for today's episode. If you've got any questions or comments, please send me an email. My email address is in the show notes. It's always nice to get emails from listeners to say that they like what I'm saying. In some instances to say, but maybe there's a different interpretation, or even just an idea or two for a future episode. Then, as always, I would like to remind you that nothing in this episode is intended to be tax advice or a replacement for fact-specific tax advice. The podcast is for information purposes only. Until next time, goodbye.